guest. So welcome to Curated Conversations, Richard.
It's great to be here, Susan. Thanks.
So clearly, we know you were born here in the United States and you received your education here.
Right.
When was it that you lived in Asia? I think it was for 5 years, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
When was that and where was it?
It was in Singapore from 2001 to 2005, 6/6, really 2005. Ostensibly there, post-business school to work for Citibank. And we were working on the corporate side. This is when we were rolling out this Visa-like payment system that we had patented at the time, and we still hold that patent. That was to replace Visa and MasterCard theoretically. And Citibank, just to show a little bit of time that has passed, back in 2002 and 2001 was the most profitable and was also the most valuable company in the world. It was the Apple of the world in 2002. How long ago was that, Susan?
Not that long.
Yeah, right.
But eons in some ways.
Right,
yeah.
exactly, right.
Wow. So, but you got around the rest of Asia as well. You spent
Yes.
some time in China.
Absolutely.
You spent some time in Hong Kong.
Right.
And elsewhere as well. Did you go
Yeah,
to
I mean, as you know, if you're in the space, if you're in Hong Kong, in Singapore, Taipei, any of those great cities that are outside, if you will, Chindia, China, India, you have to go there. And that's actually why we chose Singapore, not only because of its nice size to launch this idea with Citibank, but we also knew it was a great launching pad to all of these other great places. So yes, to answer your question, over 5 years, spent a lot of time in China and India and all the other great places in that region.
So you've got a great perspective here. So when we talk about conversations taking place between Asia and the West, what comes to mind for you? What does that mean?
Today, I think from the seat that we are at right now, one conversation that happens quite frequently is obviously about the economy and how intertwined it is. And the second topic, and I can go back to that, the second topic is, what is China? And which is sort of perplexing in some ways because this is not a new relationship necessarily. It's not a new existence either. And having spent time there, you especially, you know this, there is still this, if you will, opaqueness to what China and people from China are, or people that are Chinese and in America. The third sort of storyline that I often end up talking about is this question of, are we friends or are we not with China? The storylines are out there involving espionage cases here in the United States. Stories are out there of Chinese in America foundations, organizations, groups that are saying, why is that happening? With some cases not making it to any sort of outcome that was originally thought. So that's happening. And being Chinese American, I get asked these questions. So those are the three storylines pretty often that I get involved in.
And they're all worth pursuing, actually. I'm curious as to, have you seen, since you went there, has the dialogue shifted during the time since you first went there?
I think that what is different now is that we are seeing here in the United States, and this is the experience that adds to the dialogue, we are seeing Chinese come to the United States in all corners of our great 50 states and territories. And I think for people in America, when they see Chinese, they're finally getting that first, if you will, experience. It's a lot like what happened in the 80s with Japan. When Japan was coming to the United States, before that we really didn't know what was Japan. And so I think once we get some faces around these ideas, things will evolve regarding those three storylines that I was talking about. And you know, even myself, when I was in Asia, I made it a point to go outside of Shanghai and Beijing because there was this gargantuan middle class that we've written about, that we were reporting about. This is in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, that I wanted to see face to face. So like Chengdu and Qingchong, Chongqing, excuse me, gargantuan middle class communities, and I would argue, and correct me here, Susan, because you're the expert, that when we look at Chongqing, I think that is the largest metropolitan area in the world. It's just that it hasn't been documented. Like 35 million, is that
I
right?
think so. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Actually, that brings up another question, which is, in this downturn in the Chinese economy, what kind of an impact do you see that having on the businesses that you cover, that you know about?
What we have seen, at least on the West Coast, when you look at Silicon Valley and China, some of the investments have continued regardless of that downturn. And because as you look at better value or increased value, and you're looking at relativity that exists, although there's been some downturn in China, where you're going to get better value, and you're seeing that in Western countries. So as we look at some of the investments that have come over, if you will, stateside, surely there has been some decrease, but there's better value here, and it's seen as a, if you will, better, more dependable investment, especially when we look at what's happening in the European Union and all the questions that have popped up over time. So despite what some might call a downturn in China, you're still looking at numbers that are quite large compared to, in terms of GDP growth, to the West.
So what about the people, though, individuals that feel the impact of this? You mentioned the really huge middle class that has developed. We know that people born 30 years ago or less in China have seen nothing but exponential growth. They don't know that the generation right before them actually at times went hungry. So they're the middle class, and suddenly they seem to have some fears. Do you follow that at all? Have you been interested in what's happening regarding that middle class malaise or perhaps angst?
The conversations I've had with my friends from China, either that are here or are still there, because I do still talk to my friends that are living in China. It's a lot like, and maybe it's just me here, Susan, but as I draw parallels to our experiences with theirs, and then also putting together my experience when I spent more time in Asia, it is certainly a part of that concern about the future. It is the first, if you will, blip in what has been a long sort of hockey stick in our lifetime, right? So yes, there is concern, and I have a friend who is still in Chongqing, and although there has been some concern about wage, about the future, about the country, about its dominance, all you have to do is really hop outside in the region and see they are not seeing the great differences that I think that we might be applying to what those numbers might mean, because there's no difference in the investment in the area, and there's not much difference, I don't think, that they feel. If you speak to those in even Australia, you speak to those in Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, you pick it, various countries in Africa, they're not seeing any sort of change in the amount of outreach economically from China. I'm not seeing that, at least not in the last 4 years, because as I've traveled in the region and outside the region, and the amount of investment that's coming out of China, no, not a market difference.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned something earlier about your conversations with people here. I assume that Westerners, when they meet you, assume that you know all things about China because you have this background. And so when you spend time here in the States, you're the resident expert. And then I suppose when you go to China, your friends assume you know all things American or Western. Is that the case?
That is the case, and boy, are they wrong on both sides. You, my friend Susan, are the expert on all things China.
Well, I'm not. That's absolutely not true. But I'm curious as to whether, because you are able to get your ear to the street, for the man on the street, Chinese impressions about the U.S., are they accurate? Because we know that the impressions many Americans have of what's happening in China are not at all accurate. actually my own, China has been changing so rapidly that I think any one of us who has spent any time there, you know that it continues to change, and you have to quickly get almost re-educated. I remember when I went to Shanghai for
Right.
about the third time, and somebody said, "When were you last in Shanghai?" And I said, "Oh, let me think." And he said, "Well, if it hasn't been in the last 6 months, you haven't been to Shanghai." And I thought, he's so right, because then I went again shortly after that, and whole streets that I had gotten very fond of were gone.
It's true of so many places in Asia. China is certainly that benchmark, but you pick it, right? You want to talk about Singapore? You want to go to Bangkok? I mean, you select what that example, and we're seeing so much amazing growth. And one of the barometers I watch are planes and how full they've been. And when I used to fly back and forth from Asia like once every month or two for about that 5-year period. And I just saw the planes get fuller and fuller and fuller. Now I go back about once a year for some reason or other. And if that's any indication that we moved from 777s to 747s, even though 777s are the new plane, the 747s carry 50 to 70 more folks, and they were full, and they were adding flights, and non-stops. And so we've seen that sort of growth compared to the sort of planes that we're using going the other way, going to Europe. I think that tells you a lot.
Well, it also supports my view that people are hungry for face-to-face connection, and that these conversations take place best when they're sitting across the table as you and I are. So what do you know about the willingness of the Chinese to speak up against authority? Clearly they're not all happy with everything that's going on there, especially now that they have the growth has slowed a bit, and so they have reason to think of whose fault that is and are talking about it. Do you know much about that? Westerners view Chinese as reluctant to speak up because their government heavily censors stuff. But what do you know about that?
The passion exists, but it's how it's expressed. And I think that what we'll see on the outside is that which you just described, uneasy, or an easiness, if you will, of speaking one's mind. In a way, I think another way of looking at it is the self-editing. And that, I think, long-term can affect any generation. Because if you self-edit along the way, you're not hearing what you are thinking out loud. And if you don't hear what you think out loud, what happens over time? You stop thinking that. You don't know actually what is that next step. What is that next ring on that idea, right? Because this is all these rings that kind of pile up outside of it, and you have this fantastic developed concept. So I think as we think of that idea of not being able to express one's thoughts fully and in multiple venues, and of course this is a very Western view of the way one does do that. I feel that is not fully realized. And so when we look at some of the different ways that cultures have evolved in this region that we're talking about, where China is so dominant, it is certainly an opportunity that exists when that happy medium is reached, when those ideas can be expressed.
So that brings up the whole idea of innovation. What sparks innovation? And our view, at least, of innovation in the West is that it very often springs from the fact that people look at something and say, what if? What if it were not this way? And question authority in the process. We know that the Chinese educational system has been one pretty much of rote learning, and those that are unhappy with that have been sending more and more of their kids to the West. And with that, they think that they're getting, at least my understanding is that they think they're getting an opportunity to explore more of what's possible in the world.
Right. And that brain circulation is so important. If we don't circulate the brains, none of this is going to work the way we want it to work. Whether or not folks are for globalization or the word itself, or interconnectivity when we talk about business, it just is what it is now. So the brain circulation that you're talking about is so important, not only because of that which happens in business, but that which surrounds it, right? And so I understand what you were saying.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this thing around education because it sounds like that's a very profound issue if you really find that people, even those without the wealth to send their kids some other place to school, are looking for alternative means to educate. It's not as if the West has this knocked. I mean, we have, everybody in America is talking about the problems with our schools. I often find when I'm talking with people in Asia and they say, well, you don't have this problem because your schools are so terrific and, you know, they really foster innovation. I'd say, you know, it depends on which part of the population you're talking
You're
to.
absolutely
That's
right.
not necessarily so.
That's absolutely right.
So I'm curious as to when we see so many, as you said, when more and more Asians show up in towns in the United States, and some of them choose not to go back. To me, we gain. Maybe China loses because the idea of having people go back there once educated here, certainly there are some even here at TED in this project that I'm involved in, they're very excited about going back because they want to be the innovators. They see real opportunity for themselves there.
And there is real opportunity, is what you're saying. And when we look at this sort of reverse diaspora, which has been well documented so San Francisco, where I come from, is called Golden Mountain, right, in Chinese. And I was doing a story, I was doing some research and looking at actual data coming out of Stanford, and one of the professors who's done just really great work at looking at this reverse diaspora. And with the amount of wealth, but as well as the amount of incubating cities that have popped up around China and India and in Asia, the number of folks that are like myself, born and raised here in America, whether you're first, second, or third generation, or any way you want to count it, are going, maybe I will go to China, I will go to India or Singapore or Hong Kong or Taiwan to start my business. The number of stories you can't even count. What did I do? I went to Singapore to start a business. I am from San Francisco, Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, but we went there to do that. And that was just, I think, the tip of that spear, if you will. So if there's any thought of, there are different ways of doing this, which I think you're saying here, Susan, because it's not right for everybody, right? There's certain sort of nice corners that we all can fit in. That's the amazing thing that we're seeing, I think, coming out of China and coming out of Asia, is this lily pad jump, where now all these communities, these incubating communities, are there, and they're moving faster in a lot of ways than some of our communities here in the United States. It's really exciting.
So I'm fascinated by this, what I see, it's very different from the years when Americans, for example, would go to Europe to go to school. It was kind of like, get a piece of Europe in your head and then you come back and you're just more well-rounded. Mm-hmm. But what I see happening is what I think ends up in co-creation, that people go to these places and together, instead of thinking separately, they come up with something that didn't exist before, whether it's a business, whether it's an idea, whether it's a way to solve problems in the environment, whatever it is. There's something, this globalization of brains is pretty thrilling, I think. And I think, well, let's talk specifically about, have you followed some of the Asian companies, especially Chinese companies, Alibaba, Tencent? We know that they've been highly disruptive in a very positive way. What about the other companies there? Do you look at all at the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and are they still kind of doddering around, or are they getting pretty innovative too, or are they a has-been? What's happening? What's
fantastic, I was sitting down with the CEO and founder of Alibaba, and it's amazing to really see a person like that exist and thrive in this environment that has all of these stereotypes that one would say, I don't see how those two fit together.
This is Jack Ma you're talking
Yes, that's
about.
right. That's
the
right.
former school teacher.
That's right. And when you speak with him, you're absolutely inspired about what that really does mean in terms of new thinking. You talk about co-creation, about moving forward in exciting ways with business models. And I think one cannot help, if we just look at other models coming out of the United States and Asia, when you have that existence, it is infectious. And whether you're talking about SOEs or GLCs in whatever country you're in, they cannot help but now say, I got to be like that. I got to be like that, and I want people like that. How do I get some of that, because I know I can't bring it all into what I'm doing. So we're talking about SOEs or GLCs in China and outside of China. They start to, and it takes a while. And if you look at, because I spent some time in Singapore as an example, GLCs could not help but look at that thriving new business, new economy space. They then started to what? Pull people from it, pull brains from it, get advisory committees from it, give money to it. And so that co-creation that you just mentioned, which is so important, is exactly what I think we're seeing. You can't let a Jack Ma exist by himself and let him do so well, and it's proven in other models that are coming out. So it is only a matter of time that we're going to see, I think, this echoed, which we saw earlier in other economies coming out of Asia, and China being larger, moving at rates perhaps faster in some smaller spaces and slower in others. That's always, just to step away from that for a second, since we're talking about business, you get asked that all the time. So tell me about China. Mm-hmm. Well, what part of China do you want to talk about? And which language are you talking about? When it's food, what type of food are you talking about? And we think it's 2 or 3, right? It's pretty funny because if you, as you know so well here in your travels and time, and I'd love to read your book that you're going to write 3 or 4 different versions of, because those are always the exciting things about a place like that. I can't wait when I stop working and I can just travel around places like China for 2 years.
Now, you've had a major interest, and you've acted on it in the human rights area. Yeah. What's happening in China around that? Do you have concerns about what the Chinese government is up to in connection with human rights?
When we look at human rights, specifically with gender equality, and I'll focus on that since I do a lot of volunteer work in that space here in the United States and with the United Nations. That, I think, just based on the available, I'd say, thought leadership coming out of Asia is there's an opportunity there. And I look for thought leadership in gender equality and gender equality spaces, because if you have people that are out there thinking about it in complex ways and then turning it into practice, action-based learning is what I like to call it, because that's what I learned when I was at Michigan. I do think there's some opportunity in China to look at it in ways of how do we lead on this?
Is gender equality a really big issue in China, though? They've always, from Mao saying women hold up half the sky. I wasn't sure that was their biggest issue in human rights area.
Well, there are many issues we can probably look into, but if we just look at the one-child policy, right? If that is not indicative of some sort of understanding culturally about which is more important and which is better, having grown up in a Chinese family, and seeing that practiced from those who were even born here in this country or had immigrated at very young ages, yet still being practiced here in the United States and the great city of San Francisco, where one would not associate that with, just based on, again, I'll go back to the thinking and the leadership in gender equality coming out of places like Northern California, yet it still thrived. And so if there's anything that I see has had a generational effect, not only on my parents, but therefore on their children, me, and further generations, that is a space that I will talk about, and I'm not going to say that that is the most, because I'm not saying that, Susan, but I am saying that is certainly an opportunity to address culturally. And this is not to go into any country or any space and say, you're not doing it right, because I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's a place to explore what would be appropriate, especially since years later, I am getting stories from my aunts who did not get to go to school first and did not get to eat the drumstick.
Interesting. And now that they've changed the one-child policy, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
And it's fantastic because when you speak with women and girls now, it's a totally different.
Yeah.
It's a wholly different conversation. But again, we have these wholly different conversations in the West, yet we still have issues of gender inequality.
Yeah, no kidding. No one has gotten this thing really right.
And that's why I'm focusing just on that. And I know, and I'm not picking China out as the worst offender. I'm not. I'm just, because that's the space that I normally swim in, that I would like to talk about that. And since I have personal experience from my family who's from China, I talk to that first
Just
off.
naturally, yeah. So what about the increased pressure regarding privacy issues? Certainly here in the U.S., we've really gotten to the extent where everybody is concerned about who's looking at their data and so on. Is that as big an issue in China? And what about that? What are the ramifications of that?
Yeah, when we're looking at the issues of personal data and the exposure of it, I think that with social media, not only here in the West but also in China, so prevalently used, and knowing that often there will be certain steps taken by the government on social media, and with old school media, like where I come from. I remember the days when I was working at CNN and our signal would be cut. It would not be broadcast in China, and we would know when I was with CNN International. And this practice still exists in certain spaces in China. So I think when we look at that simple sort of editing, that would be a concern for anybody, because why would that happen? Why is that a practice that is allowed? And what does that therefore mean for all of the data that's being passed to and from me?
Well, and I suppose the very fact that social media has grown to the extent that it has, and it's only begun, the fact that the government may continue to try to put controls on this, it's going to be tougher and tougher to keep the lid on how people are able to communicate and what it is they're talking about. So that to me sounds like a very interesting challenge of the Chinese government, because they've been very adept at managing the message.
They have been very adept at it.
So I think that will be fascinating to watch, I would imagine, especially in your business.
We are, especially since it is in business. That is the Grand River, where all new ideas will come from. When we talk about social media, it is not just social media, and we talk about big data, it's not big data. It's what we're doing and what we can do with it now to understand what people are and will do. I mean, to take it to an extreme, I could potentially model what Susan will be doing after she's done with this conversation, because of how much information is available out there in the public. And if you have all access to that and you manage that data to a certain level, you can only imagine at one extreme what folks are worried about. We're not fully there, but when you talk about that, yes, it is very important. And when you do see any sort of management of that, you must become concerned. You must ask questions about that.
Well, and isn't it true that in China, at least, people are really used to being given a prescribed message, so they haven't had as strong a view about their own data privacy, their own personal privacy, as we have in the West, but it's a matter of timing, I would imagine.
Well, what happens, as you know, it's when do you let that out and how do you let that out? Yes, you're used to it, but when I was told as a kid, I had to do something and I heard, that's what the doctor said, that's what the doctor said. At a certain point you go, who's the doctor? Who is this doctor? Mom, tell me who the doctor is that says I need to eat this and do this and walk this way and do these things. And so yes, you may be used to that prescribed message or that doctor, but there's the point that you say, who is that doctor? And you express it in certain ways. So when we talk about information coming in and going out, at a certain point that's going to pop. It's going to break in a way that may or may not be good. But that is, and I say the Grand River, I'm really watching it because it's not only for China, it is for every country. As we are here and exist in this Grand River and are swimming around in it, it is got so many tributaries that have not even begun to reach out.
Oh, you're so right. We don't know the ramifications
We don't.
of all this.
We
Yeah.
don't.
It's
And
like,
so China is going to actually skip some of these intermediary lily pads that we are going through, you and I, sitting here in New York City. They're going to jump over those.
So, Richard, are there other issues that you would like to mention regarding East meets West ideas? Are there things that strike you as particularly interesting that you'd like to bring up?
I really am focused on this sort of travel and the importance of getting our faces in front of them and their faces in front of ours in every opportunity that we can. This situation, this time that we're in, and it's a good pivot based on the conversation, the way you're leading this, is we have this access to experience each other, China, United States, West and East, remotely and digitally. And when we think of the effective ties that we can build around that, that's really great. If we think back just 50 years, I'm not going to have a great friend, or I would be able to have seen this great friend anywhere in the world. I can do that with as many as I'd like, and it's for free. And that's really awesome, isn't it? To build these amazing effective ties, friendships, groups that can talk in all sorts of ways. If you were looking for a group of Chinese that are under 5 feet tall, that could speak 20 languages, that enjoyed red chairs and certain types of you can find a group like that. And,
yes.
and I love that sort of specificity of being myself and wanting to have that sort of relationship, a friendship with folks anywhere.
Well, I think there's no question that there's a major appetite, at least on the part of Chinese, to know a great deal about the West. I learned recently that there are more people in China studying English than there are English speakers in the world, which is a fascinating thing to ponder.
Wow.
And
not surprising.
Not surprising.
Yeah.
But when you look at what's happening in the West, we have had an explosion of interest in kids learning Mandarin.
Right.
And some Cantonese. But then you think, but it's not universal. They
Yeah.
all don't take Mandarin in school, although there's more and more interest in it. And I think that's the precursor, that ability and that acknowledgement that there is another way of thinking expressed in words, in the spoken word, that adds to this kind of curiosity. We have to get in front of each other face to face. I agree with you about travel. I have this thing that I always say, that face-to-face conversation has become the new luxury, because there are so many ways to reach people using technology. But when you can then cement that,
Yeah, right.
or even begin it by having the great experience of sitting in front of somebody and finding how you're different and then how you are so similar.
I would say it's not only the new luxury, it's the new requirement. Because we will start, and we've seen it in certain spaces, we over-depend and lean on non-face-to-face communications and linkages. We over-depend on them. We can see this in the United States with the way we're functioning, and why we may have some of these conversations that unfortunately we've had to report on as journalists in the last 2 years. And it's because we don't just get face to face. We don't spend 6 months or 3 months or 2 weeks in a place that's very much different than us. And that you can't replace that. I mean, going to the Sichuan province, there's only one way I was going to see these largest and understand these largest middle class environments. There was only one way when I was going to college, going to understand what Russia meant during the Cold War. And were these people really evil?
Yeah,
All of them.
You have to see it.
Until I was in Moscow staying in a home. And now that we have this great ability to make all these friendships and these ties and access groups and organizations, it is not only the new luxury, it's a new requirement.
I like that. I think you're absolutely right. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for your insights.
Thank you, Susan.